Well, now we're going to shift gears even more. We're going to be moving on to talk about what's next. So we've been talking about all the things that we've been encountering in our journey thus far, and Dr. Calabrese is putting us on a path. And now we are delighted to have Dr. Peter Grayson present on what's next, resources for your journey to better health. And as an extra bonus here, get involved in research. We had a question there on the Q&A about how folks can get involved in research. So here's your opportunity to learn a little bit more about what you can do to be involved in research. Dr. Peter Grayson is the founder and principal investigator of the Vasculitis Translational Research Program, established in 2013, and is associate director of the National Institute of Arthritis, Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases Fellowship Program, Systemic Autoimmunity Branch. He serves as the representative of a major international collaboration to develop novel diagnostic and updated classification criteria in several forms of systemic vasculitis. His research focus includes biomarker discovery through gene expression profiling and other genomic techniques, disease classification, clinical epidemiology and immunology, and clinical trials in vasculitis. And I am going to embarrass Dr. Peter Grayson at this point and say that we're proud to announce that Dr. Grayson is a recent author in the New England Journal of Medicine, where he was published. The statement that as part of his press release, our team of researchers at the NIH discovered a new form of vasculitis and called it VEXAS. VEXAS is, did I get that right? Did I get that right? VEXAS. Okay. VEXAS is caused by genetic mutations in a portion of a patient's blood cells. Before we knew about VEXAS, these patients were diagnosed with other forms of vasculitis, such as relapsing polychondritis, polyarteritis nodosa, I'm getting these all wrong, and giant cell arteritis. Now that we know the cause of VEXAS, we can start working on new treatments that may one day cure this disease. So congratulations, Dr. Grayson, on your recent publication.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for the introduction. I want to set out by saying that I know it's the last talk of the day, and so I will promise to be brief and hopefully to be exciting. And I need to say, I guess, 3 things up front. Number 1, if a 9-year-old rainbow skeleton, an 8-year-old half devil, half angel, or a 2-year-old duck happens to waddle into my screen view, please forgive me and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Also, if you listen very closely, you'll hear my 4-year-old boxer dog who is snoring on the couch right by me. It seems like every VF related video cast I do, my dog is asleep. So with that being said, the second thing I want to share up front is that I'm going to paint a very rosy picture for you about the state of vasculitis research, because it is very strong and very healthy and so much progress has been made. But the third thing I want to emphasize is that I understand that a lot of you here are newly diagnosed patients, that many of you may feel quite ill, that you're quite scared, that you're suffering. And I want to acknowledge that. And I want you to know that that's the reason why we do this work. That's why we're doing research. And so your stories matter to us. There's a lot of work to be done, but I hope you'll take some comfort in the progress that's been made. And what I'd like to do is kind of outline for you the history of vasculitis research and where we've been, where we're going, and what the issues are at hand. And I really want to just focus my talk on some of the fundamental questions that patients always ask. Am I going to give this disease to my kids? What caused it? Are there going to be a cure? I want to go there with this talk. So you've heard a little bit about this through the course of these discussions that Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is probably the most famous physician scientist in the world at the moment because of the coronavirus pandemic, he actually started his career doing vasculitis research. And here he is way back in the day. So about 50 years ago, he started the first ever vasculitis research program in the United States at the National Institutes of Health. And why I bring it up is because I want to tell you, what did vasculitis look like then? When Dr. Fauci was trying to treat these patients, what were the challenges that they faced? And he would bring in patients with ANCA-associated vasculitis, or as it was known then, Wegener's granulomatosis. And these patients were not doing well. They were dying from disease. It was the early days of using steroids, and there really wasn't anything else. And they were one of the first groups that actually gave these patients cyclophosphamide or Cytoxan. And you've heard this covered in a lot of the talks before me. But it was a miracle drug. It was life-saving for these patients. And it really set the clock into motion that we could take these diseases that were quite serious, that were often fatal, and we could reverse that course. And we've made so much progress now that these are manageable conditions. The next stop along the vasculitis history journey happens in 2005. And this is a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine looking at a drug called etanercept. And they were giving this drug to patients with, as it was known then, Wegener's granulomatosis. And the drug didn't work. It was actually a negative trial. There was no benefit to this drug. But it's still one of the most important trials published in the history of vasculitis because it indicated and signaled the rise of collaborative research in vasculitis to accomplish clinical trials. This was done by a group of investigators across North America who got together and realized, hey, we're dealing with very rare diseases. The only way we're going to make progress is if we work together, if we share our data, if we share our patients. And they were able to very quickly get to the answer that this drug didn't work. And more importantly, they were able to create the infrastructure that still exists today that allows us to quickly conduct high quality clinical trials. And you've heard a lot about the treatment options that are available now for vasculitis. You've heard many drugs floating across the screen today. And a lot of that is based on the fact that this last generation of physicians and researchers worked hand in hand. And also, it's very much dependent on the fact that patients participated. And that they showed up and that they were involved. And they, it can be scary to think about participating in research, but we don't make progress unless we work together. So what are the issues of the day? What's the challenges ahead of us? And you've heard a lot of them, and you will feel a lot of them intuitively as you bump into them during your journey. But these are the ones I think that are the big ones. I want to emphasize control of the disease with medications is the expectation now. We can get control of your symptoms for most patients. The problem is that we don't really know how long a patient needs to stay on medication. Are these permanent diseases? For some patients, they need a little bit of therapy for a little bit of time and they can get off. For other patients, they need it lifelong. And we're still trying to figure out who is who. So can we predict what will happen and treat accordingly up front? Can we use less steroids? A key theme that you've heard in a lot of talks today, and we're making good progress on that front. And I know patients are looking forward to the day when they don't have to use steroids at all. But the ones I want to focus a little bit on is the two fundamental ones, the biggies. So what caused my disease? And patients newly diagnosed, this is one of the main questions that they ask. And then they get used to having the disease, and maybe this question kind of disappears a little bit, but it really should be at the forefront of all of our goals as we conduct research programs. And is there a cure? So why did I get vasculitis, right? We get asked this a lot. And most of the time, the doctors, like myself, will hand wave. We don't know is the short answer of this. But we do know, like most issues related to health, it's usually a combination of your genetics, your DNA, what you're born with or what you inherit from your parents, and your environment. And you heard a lot just in the last talk about lifestyle choices and what you can do to modify your environment for the sake of wellness. If you think about research into environment, a lot of people have tried to figure out, is there an environmental exposure that causes my vasculitis? If you ask patients, they have a lot of ideas about this, but when you aggregate them all together, everybody has a different idea. It's not that there's one clear, obvious exposure that seems to be driving the disease. So as far as what we know, environmental exposures, we're not sure. There's really not been a clear one that could definitively trigger this disease in most instances. So what about your genetics? What do we know about that? Is vasculitis a genetic disease? Well, it's not exactly a genetic disease, not in the way that we typically think about genetics. So we often think that we inherit a gene from our parents, and maybe that gene has a misspelling or a mutation in it, and that's what causes the disease. And if that were true, it is true in many forms of disease, like sickle cell. But if it were true for vasculitis, it wouldn't explain what we typically see, which is that vasculitis very rarely runs in families. Normally, when you inherit a bad gene and pass it around in a family, then multiple members of that family will get the condition. We almost never see that with vasculitis. The reassuring part of that is that it's extremely unlikely that you're going to pass this down to your children. This is not how the disease tends to work. If you do have vasculitis and it's running in your family, then I want to hear from you, because that's an opportunity for research, and please get in touch. But that's really, really the minority of patients. It's not a strongly genetic disease in the way that we think about genetics. And similarly, when we do genetic studies, we see that genes contribute to the disease, but they play very small effects. There isn't one obvious gene that's driving everything. So as Sarah mentioned to you, we actually had a breakthrough recently in a disease called VEXAS. And I want to tell you a little bit about that only as a way to highlight to you how we may be cracking into these problems of, how genetics could drive vasculitis when we traditionally haven't been able to detect that. So I started a program at the NIH in 2013. It's the second vasculitis program after Dr. Fauci's program ran for several decades and then closed in 2005. And we've seen more than 600 patients with vasculitis at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland, and it's open to all patients with all forms of vasculitis. But currently, we've really been focusing on relapsing polychondritis and especially Takayasu's arteritis, but also some of the other diseases listed on this slide. And you can notice this is a pre-pandemic picture when I was shaving and cutting my hair. My mother would have been much prouder of me then. So this paper came out this week, as was mentioned in the New England Journal, and I wanted to tell you just one little piece of it so that you understand the concept, because I think this is going to be important to figuring out cause of vasculitis for many different forms of vasculitis. And that is, we realized that we were thinking about genetics incorrectly in this disease. It wasn't a problem with the genetics that you inherit from your parents. It actually was a problem with your genetics that you developed later in your life that was just specific to you. You could have a mutation that occurs in your body that you weren't born with, that you didn't inherit, that could cause the disease. And we've thought about that for a long time, but we finally found an example of it. And so this slide talks about the timing of when mutations happen. So you could, and these are what we call somatic mutations, mutations that are unique to you and they're not seen in your parents. You could have that very early on in development, or you could have it much later out here in adulthood. And this is where we have found this new disease, is when a mutation happens much later in life, it may only affect a small little group of cells in your body. And the trick is trying to find those cells. And so, as was mentioned, we've just recently identified this cause of vasculitis called VEXAS. And how it works is that inside your bone, you have what's called bone marrow, and you have these cells called stem cells, and they make all of your blood. They make billions of blood cells. They make your red blood cells, and they make your white blood cells. And your white blood cells are the cells that drive inflammation. These are the bad actors in vasculitis. These cells are what's contributing to why you feel unwell, and they're made by these stem cells. And what we noticed, or what we found, is that in one of those stem cells in your bone marrow in patients who have VEXAS, there was a misspelling. As the cell was dividing, it mutated. The genetics changed, and it mutated in a gene called UBA1. And it gave that stem cell an advantage in your bone marrow, and it started to grow and to take over your bone marrow. And the thing with this cell is that all of the blood it makes, all of those white blood cells are bad blood. They're inflamed blood. And so patients who have this mutation, the cells are causing all sorts of problems with them. But what we found that was really, really cool and exciting to us, because it really advances our understanding of vasculitis in general, is that patients with VEXAS had a lot of different clinical symptoms. They actually had a lot of different forms of vasculitis. They didn't have one form. Some of them looked like polyarteritis nodosa. Some of them have looked like giant cell arteritis. Some of them have looked like ANCA-associated vasculitis, and many of them have looked like relapsing polychondritis. So one mutation causing what looks to be like many different diseases, or one mutation hiding out in different forms of vasculitis. And what that means is for these patients, we now know what's causing or driving their disease, and we are going to start to work to see if we can fix it or if we can cure it. And I believe that there's going to be more of diseases, and more people with vasculitis will have these kinds of mutations either in their blood or perhaps even in the blood vessels, the arteries themselves. And it's the job now to go find them. Before you get too worried, I would say that VEXAS is a very unique, specific disease. It happens only in older men, and they have another feature that's very prominent in that their bone marrow and their blood counts get into trouble over time. So if you are an older man and you have a form of vasculitis and you're starting to require blood transfusions frequently, this is a disease that we as doctors need to start to consider. And if that is you, please get in touch. So why should you consider participating in research? Research has transformed vasculitis from a frequently fatal condition to a manageable disease. But there's still a lot of work to be done. Personalized or these precision medicine approaches are needed. We need to know what drives your disease for you so that we can target it and treat it specifically. That's how we're going to identify cause, and that's how hopefully we're going to get one day to cure. Why should you consider participating? This is the main reason that the vasculitis community tells us they participate in research, is that it may benefit someone in the future. And it's really an amazing community. And we are extraordinarily grateful to the patients that come to the NIH and participate in research, and that participate in research in a myriad of different ways. And there are lots of opportunities. You can get connected. There are many different ways to do this. So you can participate in online research. And if you go to the Vasculitis Foundation's website, you can learn about something called the Vasculitis Patient-Powered Research Network as a way to just participate in research from home. You can go to academic research centers that have vasculitis programs and participate, our government research program at the NIH, or even considering making donations to the Vasculitis Foundation, which has a research fund. These are just amazing times in vasculitis research. We're seeing this disease in a different way. The technology is improving and we're harnessing that. This is a patient with large vessel vasculitis, and we're using sophisticated advanced imaging techniques to actually see the inflammation in their blood vessels, to visualize the disease in a different way so that we can be better physicians and treat these diseases better. This is my Twitter handle up in the top right. This is the research nurses for our program, Elaine Novakovich, who runs the vasculitis program, and Wendy Goodspeed, who runs the relapsing polychondritis program. I'm really excited that I had the chance to directly tell you about VEXAS. That was the product of a lot of collaborative research by many, many different people at the NIH and around the world. And I really am glad that I can be with you on Halloween, and I'm glad that my kids didn't manage to come running in. So it's success all around, I think. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Grayson. That was very inspiring. And I think I just want to echo what you said, is that the vasculitis community is a very powerful community. And the more we're involved in the community, the better it benefits everyone. And, you know, I've participated, and I can say that, yeah, it's not for me, it's for the future. But I know that your work and the work of all the other doctors that have presented here today has really made a difference in our community. So just in closing here, from my perspective and just speaking for myself, thank you for what you are doing within the vasculitis community. Thank you for all of your hard work and for your research. That's making a huge difference in our lives. And again, to all the other doctors that have presented here today, thank you for your hard work and for your research.